This is a reading from St. Lydwine of Schiedam by J.K. Huysmans. Chapter 8. The successor of Dom André in the curacy of Schiedam was another Premonterian from the same monastery in the island of St. Marie, Jan Angeli of Dordrecht, or Jan the son of Angeli, as a Kempis calls him. He was a debauched creature, not less ignorant than his predecessor of the phenomena of mystic asceticism, but he had a good heart and was charitable and complaisant. At first he knew nothing of Lydwine's case, but amongst his penitents was a young girl who was very devoted to the saint. They talked often of her, and he could not but wonder what pleasure this young girl found in staying for hours near a bedridden creature whose appearance filled him personally with disgust. One day he wished to clear up the mystery and questioned her. As she was very shy, she did not dare to answer him at first, but presently, worried by his insistence, she could not avoid crying out, "If anyone has the right to be astonished, it is I, Father, for after all, you are her confessor. How is it you have never felt anything of what I feel every time I approach her?" "Bah!" exclaimed Jan Angeli. "What is it you feel that is so extraordinary when you are in her presence?" "I do not know. I cannot explain it. I feel as though I were no longer here below when she is near. I cannot explain myself, but this I can assure you, if you knew her soul, you would visit her more frequently." "I'll be hanged if I understand a word of what you are saying." "Well, Father, you have to go to her tomorrow, to confess her. Look at her hand, and perhaps then you will understand." The curé went indeed to Lydwine's house the next day, and his first care was to try and catch sight of the saint's hand, but it was buried under the blankets, because she had not, as she usually did, put on her glove. The truth was that if he had examined the palm of her hand very closely, he would have discovered the bruise of the stigmata, but she had never spoken to any one of those imprints. Only one woman, the widow Catherine Simon, had noticed them and had pressed Lydwine with questions, but she, neither wishing to own the truth nor to lie, had kept silence. Once, however, when hard pressed, she had exclaimed while joyously squeezing her friend's hand, "O head, which meant, according to Brugmann, "Silence, my secret is my own." Anyhow, she did her best to conceal her left hand, the only one of which she could make use. But what she could not succeed in hiding was the pervading perfume of spices which arose from it. This was, according to Gerlach, perceptible to the taste, and when one breathed it, one also tasted in some sort the celestial dainties which the perfume recalled. It was like a precious and fleeting taste of wine, the feverish scent of wallflowers, the pungent warmth of ginger, or above all, the fragrant smell of cinnamon. Resolved not to leave without having satisfied his curiosity, Dom Angeli said, "Dear Mother Lydwine, please give me your hand." From obedience, she stretched it out to him, and the room was perfumed. "Ah," cried he, "why have you never revealed to me that you had at your disposal the lost odors of Eden? How did I not myself discover, when I confessed you, that you were one of these souls whom Jesus loves to fill with his graces?" "Recall the conversations we had, Father," replied Lydwine. "I have often hinted that my pains were only the counterparts of my joys, and if you did not better divine my meaning, it was doubtless because God so desired." He exclaimed, "Your words have been for me like roses offered to a pig." And he was honest in thus abusing himself, for this odor which flowed from the sick woman's fingers not only reached his smell and his taste, but also penetrated to his innermost consciousness and stirred up remorse for his horrible sins. He could no longer bear it, but sighed and burst into tears, saying, "Listen to me. I feel that the Savior orders me to confide in you. I have committed transgressions without name, horrible sins." He threw himself on his knees, but, seized with shame and frightened at the foulness of his confessions, he dared not complete the list of self-accusations and became silent. At first, Lydwine was horrified at this scene, but quickly perceiving that she alone had enough influence over this unhappy being to reform him, she examined his soul to its very depths and extracted a sin which he had concealed. "Let us see," said she, "do you not commit this sin of adultery frequently?" Trembling with shame, he denied it, swearing that he did not. The saint appeared to believe him and did not insist. He left her, worried by his lie, and after a time returned. "Why have you lied?" she said roughly to him. I have seen you since our conversation on such a day, at such an hour, and such a place, again, alone with this woman. Is this true? Who has been able to reveal my misdeeds to you? He cried in confusion, and choked by his tears, he left the room and took refuge in the little garden attached to the house, to weep at his ease. When he was relieved, he came in and promised Lydwine to amend his ways. After that, he really loved Lydwine, and she was not, as we shall see, ungrateful. This Jan Angeli, who was not for very long cure of Schiedam, and seems indeed only to have held the post temporarily, was a mere passer-by in Lydwine's life. Another priest, a holy man this time, Jan Walter of Lydwine, was more especially designed by Providence to exhort her. Who was this Walter, whose 3 stepsisters were friends and nurses of the saint? Was he attached to or chaplain of one of the convents in the town? Did he belong to that order of the Sons of Saint Norbert who administered the parish in those days? I do not know. Historians tell us of the death of Dom André, which took place in 1426, but they are as silent about his successor as if he had never existed. On the other hand, did Walter fill the post which Jan Pot had filled towards Lydwine in the days of Dom André? Yes, Gerlach expressly affirms that he did. As Lydwine died in 1433, one can compute that he began to exercise his ministry towards her in 1425, for Brugman attests that he was her confessor for the last 8 years of her life. He thus overlapped Dom André by 1 year only, since Dom André died, as we have just said, in 1426. What we can be quite sure of is that this sacerdotal hatred, which had so tortured Lydwine, ceased with the death of Dom André. She could receive the consolation of the altar as often as the needs of her soul required. At one time, Jan Angeli and Jan Walter courted her even every other day, but sometimes the quinsy from which she suffered and the fevers which devoured her so dried her mouth and contracted her throat that they had to pour a little water between her lips to enable her to swallow the host, and the effort of deglutition which she had to make was so painful that she nearly fainted. God then spared her further torments from bad priests. Certainly many crowded round her, but to these she owed no obedience, and they had not the right either to annoy her or to command her. She had, besides, enough tortures without that, for her ills increased continually. No part of her body was whole. Her head, neck, chest, stomach, back, and legs decomposed, and day and night wrung cries from her. Only her feet and her hands remained almost intact, and they were devoured by the dull fire of the stigmata. One of her eyes, which was not quite dead, but could not tolerate any light, became still more tender, and bled even in half-light. They had to hide her behind curtains, groaning and motionless, and when they tried to move her to change the linen, her wounds became inflamed by the rough spiked ends of the straw. She was no longer able to look out of the narrow window opposite her bed, and see those charming skies of the Low Countries, those heavens of a marvelously tender blue, on which float knots of silver and flakes of golden vapor. The shadows of the passers-by, the boughs of the trees shaken by the wind, the masts of barks sailing on the neighboring canals, all these signs of life which, moving before her window panes, had served at times to distract her, were lost to the half-blind creature which she had now become. In the winter, too, when the sky, heavy with snow, seemed to rest on the eaves of the houses, or on the rainy days blurred the outlines of the buildings, she had still been able to enjoy that cheery gaiety within the houses of the poor, which is so typical of Holland. In her more peaceful moments, she had found distraction in the cheerful fireside, in the great chimney, which the cold had brought to life again, with its shining hook on which the singing kettle swung in a cloud of blue smoke. On the sooty firebacks, the crackling sparks clung, and the twigs of vine and white wood ash fell, whilst under the mantelpiece, which projected into the room, and near the pokers which lay on the tiles of the hearth, the high iron fire dogs, on their standards, with rounded ends fashioned like baskets, supported the dishes placed there to be kept hot. The flickering fire lighted up the cinders, the copper kettles, and the cauldrons, and flashed upon the utensils hanging on the wall: spoons, long two-pronged forks, frying pans and strainers, spits and grills and graters, all the utensils that figured in the humblest house in those days. This little amusement of watching the ashes, the hide and seek of the flames, reflected on the rounded flanks of the vessels, the clouds framed in the leaded tracery of the window panes, all those trifling things which occupy the mind of a sick person and distracts it for a moment or two, were for the future denied her. When she emerged from her divine inebriety, it was darkness that met her gaze, for the sight of a glowing coal would have pierced her eye like a point of red-hot metal, and the meals of the little household had therefore to be prepared in another room, which for her meant a great deprivation. This low, damp room in which she lay in perpetual night would have moved anyone but her to suicide. She was already buried in a tomb, and yet she had not the compensation of solitude, for the curious continued to flock around her. Whether these visits were abusive or simply idle, they crucified her, for they deprived her of those of the angels with whom she lived as a sister. At what moment did she enter into close relation with these pure spirits? It is impossible to tell, for, according to her biographers, she did not confide her secrets even to the most intimate with her. Neither can we follow, as we can with others of the elect, each step of her progress in the mystic way, for no chronology of the graces which were imparted to her exists, and it can only be affirmed that when she suffered too much, God sent his angels to console her. She talked with them as with elder brothers, and when, to prove her, Jesus withdrew himself from her, she called to them, weeping, "Where is he? How can he afflict me and not have pity upon me? He who has so insisted that I should be merciful to my neighbors. I shall never act towards them as he is acting towards me. Ah, if I exercised towards him the power of attraction which he exercises over me, I should draw him to my arms. I should cause him to penetrate to the bottom of my heart, or rather, I should penetrate him and entirely submerge myself therein." She implored them to go back and seek him, to bring him to her at all costs, and would end by weeping and crying, "I am mad. I do not know what I say." Then the angels comforted her, and smiling, brought back the divine spouse to her side. Whilst her contemporary Saint Françoise de Romaine saw the angels chiefly under the aspect of children with golden hair, Lydwine saw them under the form of adolescents, marked on the forehead with a resplendent cross, so that she could distinguish them from demons, who are forbidden, when personating angels of light, to display this sign. But her angel was less vigorous than that of the Italian saint, who boxed her ears in public when she committed the smallest fault. Lydwines simply left her, and only returned when she had been shriven, thus making her understand that it is impossible to converse with men or with women, even when animated by the best intentions, without falling into some imperfection, or at least uttering an indiscreet word, and that though conversations have sometimes some good in them, silence is always better. This flight of her celestial confidant, when people were with her, caused her most passionate grief. On fête day, at midday, she begged her confessor and one of her relations, called Nicholas, who had been dining in the house after Mass, to leave her alone for the space of 3 hours, that she might rest. Nicholas went for a walk, but the confessor, whose name the biographers omit, returned secretly to the house and stayed, watching behind the door of Lydwine's room. The guardian angel whom the saint expected appeared, but contented himself with hovering about the bed without approaching her. She asked him if she had been guilty of any sin. "No," he replied. "If I leave you, it is because of him who spies upon you there behind the door." Lydwine began to sob. Puzzled by the noise of her complaints, the priest came out of his hiding place and confessed his fault. But when she saw that it was her confessor who had annoyed her good angel in this way, she wept yet more bitterly. "Ah, Father," said she, "why do you act thus towards me? You must doubt my honesty, since you wish to verify for yourself what I tell you." These relations with the pure spirits that she wished to keep concealed were noised abroad, for certain facts could not escape being known, especially those which took place before witnesses. Every year, on the Wednesday after Quinquagesima, Sunday, Jan Walters brought the ashes. Now, one year, he could not get to her at the hour arranged, and while Lydwine was wondering if he were indisposed or had forgotten, an angel appeared and shrived her in his place. "It is done," she said when Walter arrived at last. "My brother Angel has been here before you." Walter opened his eyes in surprise, thinking his penitent mad. But on leaning over her, he distinguished a cross of dust barely clearly traced on her forehead, and he approached his own to it, in order to bless himself also with this powder of palm consumed in Eden. "How happy you are, dear Lydwine," he cried, clasping his hands. And she smiled, telling him that after the ceremony her angel had declared that in such cases the faithful would do well to present themselves at the altar with a lighted candle, in order to affirm their faith by the wax, their charity by the flame, and their mortification by the cross.